Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Old Hunt, where we are still celebrating 10 years of Bloodborne. We are playing through version 1.00 of the Japanese release, and last time we spent a great deal of time talking about the mysteries of Ebrietas and the choir. And we're not even done. We're not even done because, as always, I like to open the episode by looking back at some of the comments that I've gotten on the previous episode, and people had a lot of very interesting things to say, as usual. So I'm going to start this time with Big Gubosu, who had a couple points to make, one of which was actually almost a reminder to me that I talked about how we can conceive of the death of a particular great one as potentially being tied to their ascension to another plane, but then I didn't really connect it to some of the other things that I've been talking about in this playthrough. And Big Gubosu rightly came in and pointed out there are things in the game that we can look at and we can see how death isn't the end in the world of Bloodborne. It's often treated as a transitional state. And so treating the Great Ones as another example of this is actually in line with some of the things that we see. Like, even if we're being very, strict in our interpretation of how this could work, right? We have blood echoes. We have... those are essentially treated like, at least on the description of the Hunter of Hunters set, a sort of manifestation of a person's will, not just will, but, being after they die. And it may only be one aspect of that person, but it is an aspect of them that continues beyond death. And we can actually take those in and grow stronger. Also, this isn't such a big thing, such an obvious thing in 1.00, but definitely if you play the DLC, you know that there are figures in the world of Bloodborne who have died, even long since died, and you can still encounter them because they have moved on to a nightmare. And the nightmare realms are sort of like afterlives in the world of Bloodborne. And there is an example that we can point to in this game. We haven't gotten there yet, but we'll see it, and it's going to be important in a number of ways. Also, if we're maybe a little bit less strict, my whole crazy lore theory that I've been most interested in following as a through line through this series, the idea of our character as having died at the start of the game, or maybe is in a coma, some sort of limbo state, right? That is itself a potential way that we can see death as a transitional state where we move on to the hunter's dream as a form of afterlife, just like the other sort of nightmare realms we can see, and we can then run around, right, and then have this experience in whatever world or nightmare the rest of the world's, the rest of the world of most of Yharnam is in, right? And then, of course, there's the nightmare realms and things get really complicated. But if we conceive of ourselves as having continued after death, right, there's that. And then, of course, there's the idea recently put forward by Chard Thermos where you have beastly resurrection, right? You have people transforming into beasts upon death, and how that could tie into the idea of Lawrence as the one reborn, and Lawrence's own resurrection beforehand and then second coming, right? And this whole idea, right, of Christian thought and Catholicism that may have influenced this game seems very appropriate that death would be a transitionary state if you look at it from that perspective. So all of this could end up being tied together, and we could have these great ones who ascend. And then, of course, if we're looking to sort of examples of maybe mummified remains, we can look at the Altar of Despair and the statue that resembles Rom. Maybe that is Rom's dead, petrified body, and now the spirit of Rom the vacuous spider has ascended. Or at least maybe, right, because I do think I mentioned something about this possibility in the last episode, right, where maybe Rom, because she's vacuous, couldn't manage a complete ascension, and so her sort of half-formed nightmare realm maybe ends up interposing and creating this veil of ignorance that I've also talked about that makes it so that people can't see what's going on with the true state of the world and the true extent to which other dreams have pervaded reality because her own dream has sort of overwritten people's perceptions. Maybe? I don't know. That's purely theoretical. There might be nothing to that. But suffice it to say, the idea of great ones dying to ascend or move into some other state of being could be tied to this wider set of ideas of the way in which death isn't the end, is more of a transitional state in a lot of other aspects of Bloodborne. So I did want to thank Big Gubosu for that just idea in general. And then, of course, if you're interested in the specifics, I encourage you to check out the actual comment. Also of note, there's the idea of where we fight the Briatis, because I didn't bring this up. I've never even really thought of this, but the Altar of Despair is covered in this thin layer of water. It's almost like a reflecting pool, a little bit like the Moonside Lake, where we fight Ram. And this might actually go pretty well with Big Gubos's own idea of how Ebrietas being the abandoned Great One might have more to do with Ebrietas being sort of locked in the world of human beings, in the world of Yharnam, as opposed to the other Great Ones that are more like able to more easily traverse planes, because maybe she wanted to do the same sort of reflecting pool teleportation, transformation, whatever it is, that allows people and spirits to move between various light sources, and wasn't really able to do so effectively. I don't know. That might be nothing, but interesting detail at the very least. That sort of tied to that like shimmering water that's just like the thin layer that covers the ground in the area around the Altar of Despair. So I thought that was interesting. Also, there's sort of a pair of theories that I wanted to bring up that are like a little bit oppositional. They don't go together super well, but I think they're both interesting, so I'm going to do my typical approach and raise them both, and then you can make what you will of what I say, right? So we have, on the one hand, Rhetorical, who mentioned this isn't their particular theory. It's something that someone else in the community proposed, and they didn't get specified in this particular comment, but the idea is that you have, like, you know that the brain suckers have a surgery scar. You know that the church has a history of sticking things in heads, right? Because if you, again, this is tied in with something we learn in the DLC, but you have phantasm fluid implanted in the head to try to commune with Great Ones, and knowing that the church makes use of phantasms in particular, right? Someone put all this together to come up with the idea that the phantasms were like surgically implanted into the heads of the people that became brain suckers. And that's why the tentacle grows from there in a form that's sort of similar to the Augur of Ebrietas, except their appendage feeds on the insight that they suck from you and gets bigger after they're able to draw it out of you. So that's one theory, and I think it's good, right? I think it's interesting, and it aligns with the visual information that we get. I'm not very good at parsing visual information, but it is kind of cool that you could have it work that way. So I thought that was an interesting theory. The sort of somewhat oppositional one to that comes from Martin Szigeti, and this also I think is a very cool idea. And it was not necessarily brought up to explain the origin of all brain suckers, so there is some amount to which there could be some crossover here, or not crossover, compatibility here between these two ideas. But I really liked this in response to the idea of what may have happened to the choir, because that's a little bit of a mystery in and of itself. It sort of seems like they've transformed, but in what way have they transformed? And Martin Szigeti had the idea that maybe the beasts in the upper cathedral ward were people who were being experimented on by the choir. And they transform into beasts, and they have glowing blue eyes, and they drop blue elixirs. And also, you could have members of the choir who were doing the experiments, and maybe they turned into brain suckers, right? And so you have this simultaneous set of transformations, one that's like down because the normal human beings get more beastly, and then one that's more upwards because you have the choir members who are so lofty, they're like greater understanding of the world thanks to their experiments and things. I mean, terrible experiments, but still, right? And then they become the brain suckers intent on drawing insight out of anything they can, right? It seems very appropriate. I love that image of the simultaneous like transformation in both directions. I think that's just a really cool idea. Also, I realize I don't think I've read the blue elixir description. I did check, right? Because I think I was wondering in the last episode whether or not I'd talked about the sedatives. I have talked about the sedatives. In fact, I have had the exact same thought of, if I haven't talked about the sedatives yet, I probably should because they're very important. And then I talked about the sedatives as a result. That was more than 30 episodes ago now. When I went back and checked, I found me talking about sedatives and their translation in episode 40 of The Old Hunt, and now we're on 71. So I can't believe this series has gone on for this long. I never thought it would take this long. Anyway, I just can't stop talking. That's my problem, particularly when it comes to this game. Anyway, I do want to bring up the blue elixir, both to sort of bolster Martin Seghetti's point here, that potential interpretation, and just to cover my bases because there's something very interesting about the blue elixirs in particular. So let's go ahead and talk about the translation here. Right, so blue elixir, very straightforward as a translation, right? Literally, it's blue secret medicine, but I've talked before about how like elixir is this like secret substance in alchemy, right? So just calling it an elixir is in and of itself calling it a secret medicinal compound, essentially. So I think blue elixir is a perfect translation. But as for the description, things get a little bit interesting here. All right, so the first half is where we're going to find some support for Martin Seghetti's point, because we're going to essentially note that there are two major uses for the blue elixirs. One that's sort of the quote-unquote medicinal, and then one that's what hunters use it for. So the first one is a little bit more the, quote-unquote medicinal, and you'll see why I keep like putting it in scare quotes when I get to the description. Okay, so drinking medicine that high-level healers in the healing church use in suspect experiments. And suspect, like ayashige, can mean like strange, but there's like something underhanded almost is going along with it, right? It's not just odd, it's suspicious, right? So it's hinting at something of sinister purpose, and that's going to get reinforced when we get to the second line, right? Because the second line is that, presumably the blue elixir, right? Because this is another one of the classic things we've seen all through the writing in Bloodborne in Japanese. We get lots of references like that, and then you have to come up with the referent. Almost certainly that's the like item itself, right? The drinking medicine, that's the end of the last line, or just the item name, the blue elixir. Anyway, the blue elixir is a type of mental or maybe nervous anesthetic that numbs the brain, right? And I say mental or maybe nervous because seishin is like related to the consciousness, right? Mental faculties. But if you're thinking of the mental faculties in a physical sense, you're talking about nerves and the nervous system. So could sort of go either way on that one. Considering the second half of the description, maybe consciousness makes a little bit more sense. But if you want to sound a little bit more medical, maybe nervous makes a little bit more sense. I'm a little bit torn on that one. Anyway, right, the idea is these deaden people's brains, right? And so this gets back to the idea from the first line about those like sinister experiments, right? It seems like people are sort of just knocked out with these blue elixirs and then experimented on in ways they could never have imagined and probably wouldn't approve of, right? Presumably in these ways that the choir or any other like high-level healers, quote unquote, in the healing church would be conducting their research. Because we know healing church doesn't actually care that much about healing people. They care about performing their experiments and getting to the bottom of presumably how they can ascend and what's going on with beasthood. So that, I think, is what's going on in that first line, and that's why I think this first section ties in very well with the point that Martin Seghetti was making, right? Because we know that the choir is a high-level faction in the, healing church, and what do we know about the choir? Up, 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 up. Like, it's always up, right? They're the upper strata. That's where they live. And they're the upper echelons, right? They're the secret brains, right? They're everything that we know about them is associated with high level in the healing church. And these are high-level clerics, not even clerics, high-level healers, right? Who make use of blue elixirs. So it does make sense that you would have the choir be associated with blue elixirs. And we also know that the choir members were, brought up in the orphanage where they did all these experiments. So again, ties in very nicely with the idea that the choir would be making use of this particular medicine. You could say, of course, that members of the choir are transforming into beasts, and that's why they have these blue elixirs, but that doesn't necessarily explain the blue glowing eyes that Martin Seghetti also brought up. That would maybe suggest that the patients were under the influence of the blue elixirs and then transformed into beasts and sort of broke free of that mind-numbing influence. Or maybe because they were under the mind-numbing influence, that helped push them towards the bestial direction. I don't know. But it is an interesting thing that we could sort of tie together with the item drops that we can get and the location of those enemies. Not necessarily definitive, again, but very interesting. Anyway, the other interesting thing doesn't necessarily have a lot to do with Martin Seghetti's point here, but I do want to bring it up since it's in the second half of this description. However, hunters retain consciousness by means of bequeathed will and make use only of a side effect of that, right? That, again, almost certainly the blue elixir. But the interesting thing to me is that the Japanese is talking about ishi niori, and the ishi it uses is not what you would expect, which is will or willpower. It's bequeathed will, like you see in blood echoes, bequeathed will of blood. Now, it's possible that this is a typo. We found typos in the original Japanese before. It's possible that this is another one. So it could be just a relatively boring, mundane explanation where, hunters have a very strong force of will, and because, that particular set of kanji has, come up again and again in the Japanese, they entered it that way, and it happen to be the ones for bequeathed will, and it's just strong will of hunters that is being mistakenly rendered. That's possible. A little bit more interesting, a little bit more fun is that's not a typo, and maybe we get this idea of hunters making use of the will of the dead that has been channeled into their being, so that even though their main consciousness has sort of been dulled or shut off, they're able to continue to function. And maybe it's specifically the blood echoes coursing through them and augmenting the strength of the hunters that allows them to power through the main effect of blue elixirs. And, that's purely speculative. I mean, in the sense of that explanation, right? The fact that if you just look at the Japanese, it talks about making use of bequeathed will to maintain their consciousness. That's not speculative. We could come up with a speculative explanation for how this works, right? Maybe it's not that they use the will of the dead to continue to carry out their own will. It's the idea that they use the will of the dead and that's what gets subdued, and their own will remains conscious, right, and active, but it's subdued because the way that their presence has been augmented by the blood echoes is dimmed, is blurred, is anesthetized. So you can sort of make sense of this second possibility where it's not a typo in a number of different ways. But I do think it's interesting to think about. And if I recall, I think the official translation doesn't necessarily bring up that it's bequeathed will that allows hunters to continue functioning like this. I don't think that's necessarily a mistake. But it's interesting to come to the Japanese and look at this sort of wider field of possibilities. So I wanted to bring that up for sure. Also, let's just actually finish the description now, and then we can start to move on again. Or at least move on to some more ideas. In other words, in ceasing moving, one's very presence is thinned, right? So this is sort of the other portion that I was jumping a little bit ahead of when I was giving some potential interpretations of the ways that the bequeathed will could function to keep hunters going, despite it, the numbing effect taking, coming into action from the blue elixir here, right? Because it, quiets one's presence essentially. And that idea of one's presence being thin or not being noticeable, it's a concept that comes up a good deal in Japanese. And maybe not in this specific wording all the time, but you have the idea of I sensed your presence, right? It's one of these things where it's just sort of an accepted convention in Japanese speech, and maybe even conceptualization of things, that like you have a presence and other people are able to be aware of that presence to a greater or lesser degree. So when you have a very strong force of personality, it's very obvious where you are. And it's not like, this isn't necessarily tied to like, it's easy to see you because you're big, or it's easy to hear you because you're loud, or it's easy to feel you because, I don't know, you take up a lot of space. I don't know. It's not like anything as direct as that, right? It's this additional sense that you have of another person's presence. And like that just as a concept can come up a good deal in Japanese media. And it can be something of a challenge sometimes to translate, because I don't think that in the English language we make reference to someone's presence in the same way. But anyway, the idea, like mechanically, is you take this, you use blue elixir, and it sort of thins out your being, makes you harder to sense. And so it allows you to be stealthier than you could otherwise be, and sneak up on enemies and get like more opportunities for backstabs and things. I haven't really used it in this playthrough, but it is a useful item, and like especially if it's really key that something not notice you. And you have the luxury of being able to take your time. Sometimes you're in a tense situation and need to move fast. It's not very effective at hiding your presence if you're still running around, right? But if you're still, it really conceals your presence. If you're moving slowly, it significantly conceals your presence. If you're like walking, it conceals your presence more than you would otherwise, but it's not great. If you're running, it doesn't really help all that much. So, you know, interesting item, useful, interesting, I think, both halves of this description for different reasons. So I did want to bring that up in its own right, and then also to address the point brought up by Martin Seghetti. The other point that Martin Seghetti brings up that I wanted to address is I have a tendency, when it comes to thinking about great ones and their children, to think of this sort of interview answer from the director, Hidetaka Miyazaki, where he talks about like babies as a way of calling the great ones, right? So I've got a quote here. I found it from the interview. The great ones have all lost their children because of their positions, and as a result, they're attracted to these special babies. The babies are one way of calling them. This story setup was something I came up with pretty readily in my mind. When it comes to living creatures, the stronger or more advanced you are, the fewer offspring you produce in your life. Even with human beings, the birth rates in more advanced countries lower, right? Looking back, I wonder if facts like that were at the root of the idea. So, having read that, I sort of extrapolate to this idea where great ones, because they're such, quote-unquote high, elevated beings, have very, very few children over the course of their life, maybe only one, and even though they can have that child, they all lose that child. But that is an interpretive chain that I have gone down based off of that one statement from the director, right? That's not actually in the game itself. It's sort of reflected, but that idea, right, even in the interview, right, you can hear Hidetaka Miyazaki sort of wondering, like, maybe this was behind my thought process when I was coming up with this concept for the game and and how it works in the world, and why the great ones would respond to these special babies. So that's a whole chain of reasoning, essentially, that I've built up that doesn't necessarily have a very strong foundation grounded in the game itself. And Martin Seghetti just brings this up and says, okay, the third chords tell that great ones lose their child, not that they don't or can't have children. So Ebrieches or Ram could actually have children, and in Martin Seghetti's point of view, they think that great ones losing their children are a kind of observation, as people and other beings seek umbilical cords, which can probably only be obtained by slaying the child of a great one. So maybe this is tied in with why they lose their child, right? Maybe it's not a necessary fact of nature that the great ones all lose their children. Maybe they've just had the experience of losing their children a lot as a result of this sort of thing. So I appreciate the call to, sort of check my thinking. I don't necessarily know if Martin Seghetti meant it in this way, but I appreciate the fact that this sort of highlights my own biases when it comes to interpreting this game. And so I wanted to bring that up for sure. So that's cool. Then there's one other thing that I wanted to mention, which was I noticed that this was a separate comment from Rhetorical, who was also the person who gave me the very good tip about, not necessarily needing to switch up fire gems for bolt ones if you're fighting kin, because even though, as we saw with Abriatus, bolt is a little bit more effective, but not that much more effective. When I had the blood gem that was doing 104 additional damage in either fire or bolt, it came out to like 20 to 30 damage or something like that against Abriatus, which when you're dealing over 1,000 damage, chump change. It's hardly anything, right? So that tip ended up being very useful. Rhetorical was also sort of looking at the damage output that I was getting from my arcane rifle spear and how it seemed, didn't mean to unequip it, how it seemed sort of underwhelming. And I wanted to come back here just to show I'm getting the 32 additional damage here from the flat arcane boost. But Rhetorical makes the point that when it comes to how Bloodborne deals with the damage that you dish out to enemies, the more damage you can do, the more effective you get. And the damage calculations are very punishing when it comes to small increments of that damage. So if we think of a hypothetical example where an enemy has a defense of 25 that they're going to apply and subtract from every instance of 32 damage that I deal with them from the arcane shot of this particular weapon, right? I'm going to do 7 damage per shot. Let's just say for the heck of it that there's 8 shots that I'm going to fire. So it's 7 times 8, it's 56, like we saw in the last episode, right? When I did 56 damage to that one scholar. And right there you have it. That might be an explanation for why it's 56 damage. But if we think instead about what would happen if I was dealing 200 flat arcane damage per bullet, right? If we have 8 bullets and we're dealing 200 with each of them, and each one of those is reduced by 25, it's 175 times 8, right? Which is way, way more. Right? I'm just going to do, it's 1,400 damage. So it's interesting that even though this is the version of the game where the flat arcane damage boost to the rifle spear is broken, it's not necessarily functioning that way. And I really like Rhetorical's theory here that it's got something to do with the damage calculations, and I'm just basically not effectively adding enough flat arcane damage to make it effective. And it's the nature of Bloodborne's defensive values and their calculations for damage that is influencing how it is and isn't broken. It's also interesting to think how this is the very end of my first entire playthrough of the game. And even though I haven't finished all my Chalice Dungeoneering, I've been doing a good amount of it, more than I would have done naturally on my own first playthrough of the game. So whoever found out about this broken arcane rifle spear, right, they must have put in a ton of work to get that going. So, they have my congratulations for figuring out that particular exploit. And then, of course, the devs, good on them for staying in touch enough, presumably, if this is how this happened, to figure that out and then make it so that the system stopped working in this way that they didn't intend. But anyway, wow. It's already been half an hour. Yeah, and I haven't even gone anywhere. I was just talking about things people were saying. It's too much fun talking about Bloodborne, everybody. I'm sorry. Anyway, we've come back down here because this is one of the cool things about accessing the second level of the lecture building, is that we can now enter the room that we couldn't get access to before, where, we had that person give us the advice to throw ourselves to the wolves, right? Here we are treading a measure with the gods. We could sort of see through the window that person had this weird sort of human skull, but we could not see then that they had a spider's body. And indeed, just getting close and witnessing this sight has given us insight, has given us a greater insight into how this world works. And let's see what this individual has to say for himself.
Oh, this cannot be. You cannot be. No, you didn't. Lord Amygdala? Oh, how did this come to pass?
So there's an interesting thing there where Patches is, I don't think you ever get the name necessarily, but this is This game's version of Patches is sort of a Soulsborne stock character, always tries to trick the player character, always kicks them off some high ledge. And Patches here sort of is astonished at the death of Amygdala, right? And the way that that astonishment is expressed is slightly different in like the official English as opposed to the literal Japanese from the subtitles, but it's all very well conveyed, right? As always, I am very impressed by the work that we see on the official translation, particularly of the dialogue for this game. Very good. And we're going to keep going here. I just got the gesture. We're going to keep going with more dialogue from Patches here.
Now, wait just a moment. Do you think ill of me? Me?
And we have the option here. We could say that we think very ill of him, or we can say that we don't think ill of him at all. And I don't really like bearing a grudge. And also I think it's interesting to hear his logic if we say that we don't bear him any ill will. So I'm going to go with no.
Indeed, I should think not. I shared with you a thing most secret. Now you're witness to a miracle, and all the stronger for it. You should appreciate it if you've a grain of gratitude in you. Yes. Appreciate it.
So clearly, even Patches realizes we probably should be holding this against him, right? The other option is, I think, an interesting case in translation because you get sort of his reasoning, his defensive reasoning of why what he did is acceptable, but it boils down to the same thing. It's just that he doesn't have to make that argument when you choose this particular option. He just gets to laugh about the fact that, yeah, like if it wasn't for me, you'd never have met Amygdala. You wouldn't have had this, transcendental experience with a godlike being, and therefore you should be thankful to me. And of course, he can't contain himself. He realizes that's a ridiculous thing to be saying. But he makes that argument a little bit more in earnest. In hindsight now, I'm a little bit regretting that I went with the particular option that I did, because I realized I confused which one was a little bit more interesting to me. But at the same time, my own instinct as a player is to be more forgiving. So, oh well, I'll live with that. Let's see if there's any more. I think that's the end of his effective dialogue, but we'll see.
No matter. Such details are trifling. We're fast friends by now. Let this express what words cannot.
Oh, look at that. We get a leftward spiraling metamorphosis rune, anti-clockwise. So there you have it.
Oh, doubt me not, sweet compeer. What is friendship but a chance encounter?
Okay, I don't know if we get that if we choose the other dialogue option. Sorry, I'm recovering from a cold, so I had to jump forward a little bit. I don't know if we actually get that anti-clockwise metamorphosis rune if we choose the other dialogue option. So now I'm back to in favor of having made the choice that I made, especially because it more naturally lines up with my inclinations. But very interesting that we get a couple things from this character. Also, just I love the idea, sweet compeer, right? And what was the other one? We're fast friends by now. I love that because fast friends, it's sort of it's this word that I think in the modern sense has taken on a meaning that it didn't traditionally have, right? So the idea of being fast friends with someone is the idea that you are very close friends with someone, right? If you go back to the sense of fast as in stuck fast, or if you think of the word fasten, right? I know it's not pronounced like that. It's pronounced fasten these days, but right, a fastener, right? That's the same sense of fast, stuck fast, fast friends. That's the sense of that phrase that was originally, I think, if you look at the etymology of the term, was being used. These days, it comes to mean someone who's your friend very quickly, right? Literally someone who is your fast, they fast became your friend. So interesting sort of potential. I don't even know if it's necessarily a play on words these days, but it is a little bit of one, right? If you know the history of the phrase, that you have this idea of this character saying, "Oh, we're super close friends by now," and the way that he expresses it is, "We're fast friends because it happened very quickly," right? You forgive me, water under the bridge. Now we're good friends. Here, take this gift, right? So I think that's pretty cool. I don't know how intentional that may or may not have been as like a linguistic maneuver, but it is a very effective one. I like it. Anyway, having had that dialogue with Patches, oh man, we're not gonna go anywhere. It's too much fun talking about this game. I want to go back to the second floor here, and I want to read those notes that I did not read before. And at first I have to find out where they are. Okay. Willem Sensei was correct. And Sensei is well enough known in English that if I'm being super literal, I could just say Sensei if I want, right? Interesting that this isn't Schoolhead Willem, like we've seen on several descriptions, right? This sort of implies, maybe, that it was a student of Willem's that wrote this, because it seems like they have direct contact with Willem. Because, not that many other people would call Willem Sensei, right? But also, this is one of the notes where I'm not entirely sure who wrote it, because what a thing would it be to say if a Mensis scholar, which, again, we got here to this second floor of the lecture building by some sort of means connected to interacting with the mummy, the corpse, in that, portion behind Advent Plaza where all those Mensis scholars were, right? So this place has something to do with Mensis and the Mensis ritual, the Mensis scholars. That's where the association lies. So it sort of seems like one of the members of the Mensis sect, maybe even the leader, is saying, Master Willem was right. That's a very big thing for them to admit. Now, the choir, right, we know that the choir has reason to think that Master Willem was right. They have that whole thing where they're carrying on the intellectual heritage of Bergenworth. So it's possible that this is a note left by one of the members of the choir. It's not completely out of the line of reason. This is one of the things that we can point to say maybe part, at least, of the choir has survived by joining forces with Mensis, right? Maybe because the Mensis faction, at least someone in it, started to realize that Willem was correct. But I don't know. Again, maybe the Willem Sensei, this a little additional sort of nuance from the Japanese, is implying that it's the leader of Mensis who's actually seen the error of his ways. I'm not entirely sure. But that's interesting to think about. And that's just the first half. The second half of the line is something like pathetic evolution will be the downfall of a person or people, right? Plural, right? Our race, I think, is the official translation. And that part, right, makes total sense to me, right? Humanity, right? Mankind, right? I think Hito in that instance isn't talking about a specific person. It's talking about humanity. And it is interesting that we get the idea that this is nasakenai, which is like this broad term for what's like pathetic or disgraceful, right? And the official translation, I think, is a little bit more specific, right? Like, I think the term that they choose, like, isn't incompatible with nasakenai, but it's not necessarily the thing you might go to. So, and I know that if you're, like, big into the, like, lore theories of what could be going on with this note, right? The idea of pathetic evolution, I think, is cowardly in the official translation, right? But I think the idea of a pathetic evolution, right? I don't think pathetic evolution sounds great. But if you like the wider array of possibilities that you get from nasakenai in the Japanese, right? Maybe you feel like cowardly is the wrong interpretation for nasakenai in this instance, even though I think, right, cowardly is applicable in the sense that almost like playing it safe, right? It's this evolution that isn't bold enough, isn't grand enough, and therefore it's cowardly, right? I can see how that idea would make sense. But then that might be, because I think nasakenai is a little bit more of a broader term if you just consider it in the Japanese language. And that's sort of one of the fun things about playing this game in Japanese, is that you get a little bit more access to some of those wider possibilities. It sort of changes your way of interacting with the text a little bit. So even though I think the official translation can line up here, there are additional possibilities that you can get just from looking at the Japanese and Nasake Nai. Anyway, I'm going to teleport to another note, not going to be quite as exciting as this one. Okay, here we are again. This one, well, it's kind of open-ended, but at the same time, it's fairly simplistic. It's great one hunting, or a hunt of great ones, a hunt of great ones, right? Singular, plural, like ongoing, not ongoing, right? There are some details that are a little bit unclear. I think the official translation for this one is hunt the great ones, hunt the great ones. And it makes total sense, right? It's the idea that you want to be hunting the sort of higher ranking beings that are the great ones. And that's the most important idea to convey. And so I think it does that, right? The official translation works just fine. The Japanese, again, does offer a little bit wider possibility space here, but I don't think it's significant, right? I think it's pretty straightforward in terms of, hunt the great ones, hunt the great ones. That lines up very well with the Japanese here, and it's the same idea just repeated twice in a row. So, all right, now I'm going to teleport to the last set of notes, one of which at least is going to be very important. Right, so I'm starting with the less important one, technically. We have three long, thin, third long, thin things, which is a literal translation I just remember from Translation Born because it's so silly. But if you just translate this as 3 third chords, which is what the official translation does, you're getting across the correct idea, right? Because the, sanbon, right? The bon is a counter for long, thin things. That's why I said 3 long, thin, and then third long, thin things or whatever, right? You have the idea of sanbon me no heso no o, right? The third umbilical chords, right? And the me makes it ordinal, first, second, third. And then the hon or bon is that long, thin thing counter again, and then the numeral 3. And so this note is a little bit vague in the Japanese, it's a little bit vague in English, but the idea is you want to be using 3 of the third umbilical chords. It's supposed to be a hint that allows you to unlock the final sort of secret ending of the game. And somehow or another, whoever the scholar was who left this note figured that out. They seem unable to have put it into practice, but this is functionally correct. If you use 3 third umbilical chords and you meet the conditions for another one of the game's endings, you will unlock the most secretive ending in Bloodborne. Very cool. We're not going to get it in this playthrough, so I don't want to go too much into it. That's why I was saying that's the less significant of the 2 notes. What I care more about for this playthrough is this note. The monster of the moon of Lawrence plural. Blued blood. I went very literal on you, even though I said there's no real reason for me to be doing it, right? It's a little bit fun, I have to admit, to just throw out these, just obviously wrong ideas, because I have to just fight so hard against them. They sound so wrong, and then I get to just toss them out sometimes. And anyway, if we actually want to make sense of this, right, we have Lawrence and then pluralizing suffix, tachi. So Lawrence and one or more other people who are associated with Lawrence, right? This is some way that you can call out a group in Japanese. You sort of identify either the person you know the best or the person you associate as sort of the leader of that group, and then you say tachi, and then it's this person and their friends, this person and their, it could just be one friend, right? It's actually somewhat of a nightmare to translate tachi sometimes because you don't necessarily know if it's, Lawrence and one other person, Lawrence and several other people, how many, right? I think the official translation is something about Lawrence and his associates. Seems like a good translation there, but it might have just been a single associate to become the plural of tachi because it's Lawrence and one other person. It's really difficult to translate this without a lot of context. Sometimes you can translate tachi as you two if you know that it's just, the one person and the other person. Sometimes it has to be a group, right? Sometimes it's you three, sometimes it's unspecified, anyway, I think it's clear enough why that can be a challenge. In this case, my suggestion is that this is Lawrence and Gehrman. And we know that because, Garamond, first of all, we have the sort of cut line back from Master Willem. You think now as Lawrence, or not as Lawrence, you think now as Garamond did to betray me, but also there are a couple things in the game, and in particular, of most obvious note, is Garamond has some lines that indicate that he's waiting for Lawrence to do something. So Lawrence and Garamond, and maybe someone else, right? It's not limited to Lawrence and Garamond, but at the very least, I would suggest Lawrence and Garamond are involved in something to do with this. And then it is a monster. It is a like demonic or magical being or thing that is associated with the moon. And then we have, in quotation marks, Aozame Tachi. And then Aozame Tachi is pale blood, right? It's, right, Aozameru, it's, gone blue or gone pale, because essentially that's what that means in Japanese. And chi is blood, and we've seen this term all the way back from the start of the game. So we're finally getting to sort of close the loop on the mystery of pale blood that kicked all of this off, right? Seek pale blood to transcend the hunt, right? And we get a little bit of extra information in the Japanese that's written in our own hand before we lose our memories. So pale blood is apparently a reference that's being used for the moon presence, the moon being, right, whatever this thing is, that's associated with Lawrence and whatever group associated with Lawrence, be it one or more other people, probably Garamond at the very least, right? And this is what I was mentioning when I said we'd eventually get some pretty solid evidence that there's a great one tied to the moon. There is a great one tied to the moon. It's called the moon presence. And there's a little bit of a back and forth because I think the official English calls this the nameless moon presence. And it's possible that's sort of an artifact of an older version of the game. It's possible that it's not, right? Because when you actually you can fight the moon presence as a boss if you go for one of the endings that we're not going to get. And if you do that, it's not called pale blood, right? It's not given like an actual name in the game. You can get a dialogue from the doll that's pretty rare. I haven't gotten the rare dialogues from the doll or from Garamond in this playthrough, but you can get them, and they point to, the doll refers to Flora of the Moon of the Dream, which seems to be the name of the moon presence, but possibly that's not known by anyone else but the doll. And then Lawrence and his associate or associates apparently referred to it as pale blood. And this gets back to the idea of a sky of pale blood, right? Pale blood's sky. This alternative interpretation of that note, behold a pale blood sky, could also be interpreted in the Japanese, again, wider possibility range, as the sky of or belonging to pale blood. And pale blood we know is the moon presence, right? So we look up at that sky and we can see this is the sky that belongs to the moon presence, right? That's one way that we could interpret that if we wanted to. I don't happen to interpret it that way, but that is a possibility. And then, of course, we have just the association with our own quest to find pale blood. And everyone has sort of been misinterpreting this along the way as the idea of a variety of blood, when, in fact, it's been the moon presence all along. So we sort of, it's this fun moment where we're actually closer to our goal than we even realize. It's only just above our heads, to borrow some of the language from the choir that we've been looking at recently. But anyway, this is a very important note, and it's a little bit unclear, like, who or what knows what is or what isn't that creature's name, right? It might be Flora. Lawrence and his associates appear to call it pale blood. That might also be taken as a name, might not. The idea of nameless, I think this is another point where in Last Protagonist's analysis, he was able to find the word nameless is also in Korean, right? So this might also be a last-minute change in the Japanese that the other languages the game was translated into were sort of left out of the process. That's also a possibility here, right? So it might not have been their fault. The nameless might have been in the original, and then the developers changed their minds, and it only got reflected in the Japanese. But whatever the explanation is, right, the thing that I want to take away from this for this playthrough is that there is a great one associated with the moon, and it's referred to, at least by some people, as pale blood. And that sort of brings the quest around. And I can focus on that in a little bit more detail next time, because this time we're going to make a little bit of like physical game progress. We're going to step through this door, which once again, as in the floor below, is tied to a nightmare. We have reached the Nightmare of Mensis, right? So now we are very explicitly tying this place to the Mensis sect of the Healing Church. And look at this. Once again, the lecture hall has taken us to a nightmare, and we can't go back, right? This was a one-way trip. How does that transition work? We walk through a door, but when we traverse into the nightmare, there is nothing for us to go behind. Also, we have these weird things. Look at all these skulls that have sort of turned to stone. What does that remind you of? It reminds me of all those people that got turned to stone in the walls, right? So maybe, again, we're seeing the idea of the nightmare and the real world like coinciding, and possibly the deaths of all those people being used to build this nightmare realm out of the like otherworldly dream potential, maybe. But note that, right, we also get regular rocks mixed in here. It's not 100% like skull formation stuff. There are also more natural sections to the nightmare. So it may or may not be exclusively composed of the dead. And also in here, it's always skulls. It's not any other part of the body. Whereas in Yharnam, we have like full bodies. And this sort of, right, this idea of the skull reminds me of the ritual blood, where we can see skulls, rising out of it as it gets more and more potent. Right? So once again, we're seeing skulls being representative of death, but possibly a very specific type of death? I don't really know what to make of this. I'm not great at working with visual details, as I say for like the 100th time. But anyway, let's get out of this little ravine here. I think there's a Wandering Madness somewhere around here. I would love some more bloodstone chunks. And the baby crying is now very clear. I swear. It's like off to the left somewhere. Okay, well, first things first. Oh, of course lightning damage isn't going to do much against this thing. Alright, let's switch over. Oh, I wonder. Okay, they don't care about the blast at all. Okay. Yep. Alright, how do they feel about this thing? Oh, they're pretty hardy. Alright, so as before, these enemies are not worth dealing with. Yikes. I'm gonna die. Look at how minuscule the damage is. Ridiculous. I swear, this is harder than like the toughest bosses of the Chalice dungeons that I've been facing. They're like so much hardier. It's ridiculous. I wonder how they'd be doing if I had that fire weapon out still. Anyway, you can avoid the like worms jumping out if you kill with a visceral attack, and then I think also with fire. I'm not entirely sure if it's worth switching to a fire gem back from this bolt one just for this portion of the area or not, but might be worth considering. There it is. That's what I was looking for. I remember the good thing about coming here, not the bad. Go figure. And then, of course, once again, sort of as we saw with the Nightmare Frontier, we can look off into the distance, down into the nothingness, and see that this is sort of a land like floating among mountains and mist and like far off clouds and sun, right? This is a land in the midst of nothing, right? In the midst of like clouds. Like, what is this weird dreamscape? And I believe this might not be the place. There is a specific place where you can actually see, if you look closely, some ship's masts. This must not be the place because I don't see any. Oh, there they are. They're way far away. Nope, those are mountains? I can't tell. All right, well, I am not confident that I have properly identified... Uh-oh, not that one. This one. I am not confident that I have properly identified the location to look to get this information. But you can see the masts of the ships from the Nightmare Frontier in this location. Also, I don't want to get frenzied, so I'm very quickly going to warp back to the dream. Phew! What an episode that turned out to be. Another one very heavy on lore, very sparse on progress. But next time we're set up to make some decent progress through the Nightmare Frontier. Should be interesting. I hope you'll join me for that. Once again, my brain is pretty fried, so I'm going to take another break. I'm going to call an end to my hunt for the evening. As always, if you have any thoughts to share with me, any insightful comments to share, I welcome any sort of feedback that you might have. So, thank you all very much for watching. I'm going to call an end to my hunt for the evening, but I wish all of you good hunting. Okay, I'm not... Come on now. Good hunting, everyone.